Welcome to another episode of the MMA Lockcast. I'm your host, Manpreet, aka MMA Lock of the Night, your boy on social media at MMALOTN, and the architect behind the MMA Fight Archive, where we recently surpassed 4,000 fighter profiles for you to research from to ensure you leave no stone unturned when you're researching these upcoming MMA events. With the Contender Series kicking off next week, this is the perfect time to take advantage of the Fight Archive, especially with the 7-day free trial we have available, so you can study up on these fighters that are vying for a UFC contract and hoping to put on a highlight reel performance to get the eye of the UFC matchmakers and Dana White. But I promise you, the Fight Archive has exactly what you need to ensure you know what to expect when these fighters step foot in the cage for the next 10 Tuesdays that are coming up, considering that's how long the Contender Series takes. Not just the Contender Series, but this weekend we also have Brave CF 84, we have Invicta FC 56, UFC going down as well. For the rest of August, we also have ACA, CFFC, PFL completing their playoffs. Their finals will obviously be in November. The road to UFC is also going down closer to the end of August. LFA, a bunch of great promotions and events. But again, if you like to predict, analyze, break down fights, if you're a coach, a fighter, or a commentator, the MMA Fight Archive will ensure you know everything you need to know about these fighters before they step foot in the cage. Once again, that is the MMA Fight Archive. Check it out for a 7-day free trial. Link to that in the description below. All right. This weekend, the UFC is back with its routine Apex heavyweight main event, as we have UFC Vegas 95 going down this weekend, and we have a rematch that absolutely nobody was clamoring for, as we have Marcin Tybura looking to go 2-0 against the polar bear, Sergey Spivac. We've had some cancellations over the last couple of days. Specifically, the co-main event was canceled, I believe, earlier this morning or late last night, as Chris Gutierrez and his matchup against Javid Bashrat actually ended up getting canceled here. So right now we're only at 10 fights as of this recording, which is going down on Monday afternoon. I'll break down those fights for you guys as always here. If there are any short notice matchups put together during fight week, anytime before Thursday, I will drop an individual breakdown video for that fight. So don't worry about that. But otherwise, just this week, I'll be breaking down the UFC card for you guys. And then hopefully on Sunday or Monday, I'll get started on the Contender Series, and you guys can expect breakdowns for the entire season this year from your boy, either on Sundays or Mondays, depending on when I can get to the researching and when lines are starting to get more widely available. All right, let's do a quick recap of the Lock of the Night and Dog of the Night play from this past weekend. We go 3-0 on Lock of the Night plays. We hit a plus 100 PFL parlay. We hit a plus 170 underdog Lock of the Night play on LFA, and then Shamil Gadziev comes through with us around minus 220 for us to go, like I said, sweep the Lock of the Night this past weekend. So that now increases our Lock of the Night record on the year to 57-28 for a 67% hit rate. Again, nowhere near the mark where I want to be. We are in the profit, so I'm happy about that, but we still got a lot of work to do to close out the year and try to get closer to what the goal was. Now, in terms of the Dog of the Night, again, very bad year in terms of me being able to pick Dog of the Night plays. We've cashed some underdogs, but sometimes I forego actually making the dog that cashes as the Dog of the Night. So this past weekend for the UFC, I did cash on Sam Hughes as a dog, but I ultimately ended up giving Michal Oleksiejczuk the Dog of the Night moniker, and he ends up coming up short against Shara Magomedov. We got everything we needed from Oleksiejczuk in terms of continuous forward pressure and throwing heat, but it was the slick technical striking of Magomedov that landed more damage and hurt Oleksiejczuk more often than not, which caused Oleksiejczuk to rip up our tickets there. So we go 0-3 on the weekend on Dog of the Night plays. That now drops our record to 26-59 on the year for a 30% hit rate. Not a good look on the Dog of the Night plays. Thankfully, we have the Lock of the Night plays anchoring us here and keeping us in the profit. All right, last plug here pretty much. GodzillaWins.com, allowing your boy a platform to drop written content on a weekly basis. Thursdays, we drop the main event breakdowns. Fridays, we drop the 3 best moneyline spots. So make sure you guys check it out, GodzillaWins.com. And also just a quick plug for the MMA Lock of the Night, MMALOTN Patreon page. They get all the breakdowns before you guys get it on this video platform. I do my best predictions article. I got a ton of fun parlays. We had the parlay party this past weekend where we hit a plus 100, 200, and 400 parlay, I believe it was. So make sure you guys check it out if you want to get in on the action there. Not to mention suggested same game parlays. A lot of great content on the Patreon. Not to mention regional card breakdowns as well. So all of my breakdowns are posted there first and foremost. Then I eventually filter them through to the YouTube page. So if you want to support your boy, that is the best way to do so. All right, without further ado, we got 10 fights to break down for this UFC Vegas 95 card. So without further ado, let's kick it right off. First fight of the night goes down in the strawweight division. We start the night with a rematch and obviously end the night with the rematch. But this one comes in the strawweight division with Stephanie Luciano coming in as a minus 170 favorite going up against Talita Alencar, who comes in at plus 145. Now we'll start off on the Luciano side, who earned her contract by going to a draw with Talita Alencar on the last season of the Contender Series. That was a matchup where she got grinded out for the first 2 rounds by Alencar, who is a very good BJJ specialist. But then we saw Alencar's gas tank issues come into play, and that's where Luciano was able to pour on the damage. And she made some questionable movements in terms of engaging in the clinch a little bit too long, eating up a little bit too much time by letting Alencar sit on her back. But she did enough damage that all 3 judges ended up seeing that round as a 10-8, and then we ended up getting a draw. It was hilarious watching the end of the show that night, and Dana talking about who's going to give the contract to. He talks about both the women who were sitting on the podium there, and the only good things he said about Alencar was the fact that she was a 6-time BJJ national world champion, or just world champion. National world is kind of redundant, but that was the only thing good he said about her. And then he started praising Luciano, saying that she just seems to have it. And, as soon as she stepped in the cage, he knew that she was special. And then seeing how she was going for the finish in the 3rd round, he signed her immediately. But luckily for Alencar, she ends up getting signed as well. Maybe not so on the night, but she did end up making her UFC debut earlier this year, where she went to a split decision over Hyen Amanda. Very close fight, came down to the 3rd round. A lot of people are scheming robbery there, but it was a very close 3rd round. The last impression that was left on the judges was Alencar rushing forward with a barrage of shots, landing some good shots on Amanda, and then the buzzer going off there, and then ultimately Alencar wins that matchup. Going back to Luciano, she normally likes to implement her striking. She has crisp shots down the pipe, likes to engage in the clinch a little bit and rough her opponents up there. Her urgency in terms of staying out of bad positions is a big positive as well, which has helped her, get that fight to Alencar to ensure that she didn't get submitted or get finished in those fights. She was constantly working off her back in terms of trying to pull off a reversal or getting back to her feet. And that's going to be important for her again this weekend against Alencar. Now, Alencar, like I said before, 6-time world champion in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, high-level BJJ black belt. She pretty much finished all but one of her opponents on the regional scene before getting to the Contender Series. And she showed a decent enough gas tank on the regional scene to go 15 minutes, but obviously on the Contender Series was a huge question mark there. In her first fight in the UFC, it was impressive to see her manage her gas tank a little bit better, striking a little bit more, not going for as many desperation takedowns. But I think it depends on the level of opponent she's going up against and if she can actually stay safe enough in the striking realm without having to shoot desperation takedowns. And I think that's going to be the issue with her this weekend against Luciano. Luciano is clearly the better striker. And if she had just improved her takedown defense a little bit more, made a couple more better fight IQ moments, she could eventually keep this fight in the striking realm where she'll have a decided advantage over Alencar. Alencar could make this close if she is able to complete those takedowns or at least trust her striking a little bit more to open up better takedown opportunities. But I still believe Luciano will end up getting the better of those exchanges, getting the better of the striking, landing more damage, and winning this fight on the scorecards. Not a whole lot of confidence here, but just based on damage alone, I think we'll see a better performance here from Luciano, who's still pretty young as well and has been out of the cage cage for over a year. So that's something to keep in mind as well. But the prediction here is going to be Luciano and Luciano by decision. All right, next up, Youssef Zalal coming in at minus 350. I believe the biggest favorite on the card. Going up against Jarno Errens, who comes in at plus 285. Now, Zalal actually ended his initial stint with the UFC going 0-3-1 over his last 4 fights. He ended up getting cut from the UFC, going back to the regional scene, producing 3 straight first-round finishes, and then he got the opportunity to step in on short notice earlier this year to take on Billy Quarantillo, and he ended up finishing him in the second round after dominating him throughout the first. Now, Zalal normally showcases a solid all-around game, very good striking, a very consistent leg-kicking game, which proves to bear fruit with the rest of his game, but a very aggressive grappling game, just as we saw from him last time around. Against a BJJ black belt in Quarantillo, he looked pretty damn good implementing it. His cardio is very high level, considering he trains at elevation at Factory X, and this is a guy that was pretty much an average UFC fighter when he originally got called up in 2020. But I think this newfound aggressiveness that we've been seeing from him, even on the regional scene, will transfer to the UFC and probably allow his ceiling to rise compared to what he was initially seen as when he was first in the UFC. He's going up against Jarno Errens here, who finally picked up his first UFC victory in 3 attempts last time around, as he took advantage of the poor striking defense of Steven Nguyen and outstriking him, outdamaging him, and winning that fight on the scorecards. Prior to that, we've seen Errens get grinded out by William Gomez. We saw him get outpointed by Sung Woo Choi, and it just seems like better strikers can get the better of him. Better grapplers can get the better of him. The only way he really finds success is if he can get into his groove with his striking and really start touching up opponents with that slick striking approach that he brings to the table. He also has a judo background, but I'm not really thinking that's too effective at this stage in the mixed martial arts world, considering we've seen him get taken down. We've seen him land takedowns but not have good control of his own, but it's his ability or his flaw in the takedown defense game which causes him a lot of issues, and which is something that Zalal could potentially take advantage of. Now, Errens is tough to put away, and I do think that Zalal will look to utilize his full bag of tools here, striking and probably even being the better striker here with Errens, but also mixing in the takedowns here to really separate himself on the judges' scorecards. I think that's something that Zalal learned a lot. There were some very close fights through his initial stint in the UFC, and I think he knows that he needs to turn up the volume and the aggressiveness if he really wants to separate himself from his opponents and get his hand raised if he's unable to get the finishes. In this matchup, I think he's worthy of the chalky price here. I don't think Errens is that good. I think he, I did try to favor him against Sung Woo Choi, but seeing him get out grinded by a striker was just not a good thing in my opinion. And then seeing him win that fight against Steven Nguyen, we all know what Nguyen's issue is in that striking defense, and Errens took full advantage of that. Zalal will be a lot cleaner and harder to deal with, and I think that we'll see Zalal bring a much better overall game here, and that will allow him to grind this fight out and win it on the scorecards. All right, next up, heavyweights throwing down here as we have Kianzad Diniz coming in at plus 175, going up against Carl Williams, who comes in at minus 205. Now, starting off on the Diniz side, who has a clean 7-0 professional record, earned his UFC contract through the Contender Series last year, knocking out Eduardo Neves, and then announcing his arrival to the UFC by knocking out Austin Lane earlier this year. Diniz comes from a kickboxing background, and you can see that on display when he really starts to get into his groove and starts just stalking his opponents with his combination striking. He doesn't chase the takedown, which makes him so dangerous in the striking realm because he doesn't often overextend. We see him just walking his opponents down, landing simple but effective combinations, and then eventually he sees his opponents get hurt from the power that he possesses, and then from there he's able to walk them down even more and eventually find the finish. We did see a bit of a hole in his game last time around against Austin Lane, who shot for a takedown almost immediately, something that Diniz probably was not expecting him to do so quickly. And that ultimately saw Diniz have to fight the rest of the matchup off of his back, at least the first round. But he did a good enough job, even after getting put into a very bad position in terms of staying alive in that fight and living to see the second round. Once the second round started, we saw Lane's wrestle-heavy approach not come to fruition as Diniz was more privy to it, utilized good footwork, pivoting off, good takedown defense, and eventually getting the motivation and the morale of Lane very low. And that's where Diniz was able to start walking him down, land his big strikes, and the knockout opportunity eventually found itself. If he can continue working on his takedown defense and really just snuffing out any attempt that's coming from his opponents, this guy's going to be very dangerous with the striking background that he brings to the table. He's 33 years old, which is not too bad when you're considering heavyweights, and most of those guys usually get into their prime in the latter half of their career, especially 35 and older. Diniz has a chance to break into the top 10 if he can keep fights in the upright position, because he's probably one of the better strikers that the heavyweight division has as a whole. Now, next up, Carl Williams on a solid winning streak of his own recently just survived a victory over Justin Tafa last time, where he had good success in the first 2 rounds with his grapple-heavy approach. But in the 3rd round, he got hurt very badly, almost got put away, but Justin Tafa continued to make small mistakes that allowed Williams to eventually take him to the ground and grind that fight out. There were big mistakes that Tafa made in the first 2 rounds as well, throwing a ill-advised knee where Williams was just waiting for that opportunity to grab onto that knee and drive him to the ground. In the 2nd round, Justin Tafa throws a head kick for some goddamn reason, and Williams drives through and gets the takedown there, easily winning those first 2 rounds. And then in the 3rd round, we see Tafa get a little bit too overzealous after hurting Williams, and that opened up the opportunity for Williams to wrap him up and eventually drag him to the mat. Williams is a strong wrestler, and he does his best work when he's able to assert that dominant position from top control, but he is not much of a finisher in recent fights. Out of his last 5 wins, he's only finished 1, which was that 5th fight, and now here he is on 4 straight decision victories. The first one was his Contender Series winning performance, where he came in as a pretty big dog and ended up defeating Jimmy Lawson and earning his spot on the UFC roster. His striking leaves a lot to be desired. He just throws out that, he peppers out his jab, waiting for the opportunity to change levels and get his opponent to the ground. Otherwise, he's susceptible to getting hit on the feet, especially later on in fights when his cardio is really starting to wear on him, considering the amount of energy that he takes to try to grind his opponents out through the first 2 rounds with his wrestling. Now, in this matchup, I can see the obvious case of people leaning on the wrestling of Williams, thinking he can get Diniz to the ground with ease and then grind him out from there. However, considering the lack of finishing prowess from Carl Williams, especially when he gets his wrestling going, and the improving takedown defense of Diniz, if Diniz has his guard ready to go from jump here and not be lackadaisical like he did in the opening seconds of his fight with Austin Lane, he could make this a tougher night for Carl Williams than the odds suggest. Diniz is clearly the better striker here, and if he can survive that first round, which is when Carl Williams will be at his best, he should be able to start taking over the fight in the 2nd and 3rd rounds. And I think with that, he should be able to maintain his distance, keep his feet underneath him, utilize good takedown defense, pivot off whenever Carl Williams tries to shoot takedowns. And then from there, we should see a turning of the tide, just as we saw in Diniz's last fight against Lane. So I get the love for Williams. Sure, it looks like he's going to go out there and just completely wrestle fuck Diniz to the mat and just have his way with him. But I think we've seen good enough takedown defense from Diniz in the past. And when he is really on, he's going to be very difficult to take down. And then there is a clear striking advantage in Diniz's favor when this fight is in the striking realm. So I got to take a little bit of a shot on Diniz as a dog in this spot. If you are a little bit too hesitant in the early going here, I think this is a great live betting spot as well, because it's more than likely that Williams will land a takedown in the first round, which will probably put Diniz at plus 250, plus 300 going into the 2nd round, especially if Carl Williams is unable to finish him. And then from there, I think Diniz could really start to take over. I think his footwork and just his base and the fundamentals that he's learning are going to really help him in the spot against Williams. And then Williams will struggle to get this fight to the ground. And then from there, Diniz, power advantage, striking advantage, it should be all in his favor. So I'm going to take the risk here. I'm going to go Diniz by knockout, but it will be sweaty early. I will not beat around the bush in regards to that. Williams will likely get that first takedown, but his inability to finish opponents on the mat, I think, will come back to haunt him here, and Diniz should finish him in the 2nd or 3rd round. All right, next up, women's bantamweight matchup here, as we have Carol Rosa coming in at minus 175, going up against Patty Kianzad, who comes in at plus 150. Now we'll start off on the Rosa side, who's coming off a decision loss to Irene Aldana last time around. I believe that fight was back in December. And that was a matchup where we saw Rosa land a women's bantamweight record 95 leg kicks, but she still ended up coming up on the losing end. The first round was very good for her in terms of landing the leg kicks with good damage, with good significance, which I believe all the judges ended up scoring in her favor. But in the second and third rounds, we really saw Irene Aldana start to turn it up, kind of accept that she was going to get leg kicked, but really made Carol Rosa pay with the 1-2 down the pipe. And that was really starting to bloody up the nose of Rosa. Clearly, the damage starting to go into Aldana's favor. And then Aldana went on to win that fight by decision. Now, Rosa has had some lack of urgency moments that have cost her in the past. Most notably her fight against Norma Dumont, where Dumont cage pushed her for almost 2 full rounds before she finally woke up in the second or the third round and eventually started having success of her own. In the Aldana fight, she was comfortable in that first round. She won that first round, but the second and third round, she was still too comfortable just throwing leg kicks and not trying to throw damage in return with her punches, where Aldana was clearly having the advantage. Rosa was a fighter, I believe she started her UFC career 4-0, but has really fallen off since then, as now she's 2-3 over her last 5 fights. She is skilled, she has potential, and she's still only 29 years old. So there could be improvements in her future, and she will really need one this weekend if she wants to avoid a 2-fight losing streak. Her opponent is on a 2-fight losing streak in Patty Kianzad, who last time around got submitted by a former foe in Macy Casson. And that seems to be the issue in Kianzad's game, is the takedown defense and her inability to work back to her feet. Now, we saw some glimpses of success from her in her fight against Kiasson last time around, working back to her feet a few times, but the scrambling ability and grappling edge of Kiasson eventually proved to be too much, as Kiasson was able to get the back again and eventually sink in a rear naked choke. Kianzad at her best is a fighter that likes to get her striking going with her volume-heavy approach, likes to utilize her footwork, her kicks, her punches. She throws in bunches as well, which is very good, especially if she can maintain her distance and stay in the striking realm. But it's really when opponents really chase after the grapple-heavy approach where we see Kianzad face issues, just as we've seen in her last 2 fights against Katlin Vieira and Macy Kiasson. But it's just tough to ensure that she's going to continue to make those improvements where fighters can't put her on her back and can't keep her on the defensive in that end. And it also doesn't help that she doesn't throw, she is not too much of a threat in terms of the power that she's throwing with her striking. So opponents are kind of able to close that distance easily, get the fights to the ground, and do what they want from there. It is, like I said, impressive that we're seeing slow and incremental improvements from Kianzad in her grappling, but I still think if fighters really want to chase that approach, they can get the better of her. Now, Rosa has that in her back pocket. I think if she really wants to grapple here, she could get the better of Kianzad. I think in the striking realm, if Rosa really starts to sit down on her punches and starts to let solid offense go behind her leg kicks as well, she could be very effective there too. I think Rosa is the better overall fighter here, but the lack of urgency in certain fights give me pause in terms of playing her at a minus 175 range. If you can get her closer to minus 130, minus 140, if there is some significant line movement on Kianzad during fight week, I think that would be the better way to go about it. But this is a fight that's probably going to go to a split decision. Maybe taking either of these women to win by split decision will prove to be fruitful, but I still am going to lean on the Rosa side here, as I think she's the better overall fighter, and I'm really hoping that she decides to go to her grappling here behind her striking so she can separate herself on the judges' scorecards. Next up, we got a bantamweight matchup between Toshiomi Kazama coming in at plus 185, going up against Charalampos Grigoriou, who comes in at minus 220. Now, Kazama is I believe a BJJ black belt, but a BJJ wizard. When he's able to get fights to the ground, this guy looks like an elite fighter. However, it's the unfortunate nature of the MMA game that every fight starts in the striking realm, and unfortunately for him, he's lost back-to-back matches in the first round by getting knocked out by his opponents. His traditional takedown approach is not the greatest. He normally relies on trips or even pulling guard to try to get opponents to the mat so that he can get his jiu-jitsu game going. Otherwise, he really is ripe for the picking on the feet by superior strikers and guys that can avoid engaging in the clinch with him, or at least avoid any sort of contact with him and just stick to a striking heavy game. It would be great to finally see Kazama try to get fights to the ground so that he can showcase his BJJ approach and showcase why the UFC decided to sign him to the UFC or to the promotion even after losing the road to UFC final to Rinya Nakamura. He's fun on the ground, but unfortunately for him, fights don't all start on the ground. Now, his opponent Grigoriou dropped his UFC debut earlier this year against Chad Anheliger in a matchup where I thought he was going to be the superior striker with the karate-style approach that we normally see from him, blitzing in and out of the range of his opponent's landing shots, utilizing a kick-heavy game from distance as well. But for some reason, maybe it was some power that Anheliger landed on him early. We saw Grigoriou look to take this fight to the ground, and it did not pay off for him at all. He had a solid first round with some good damage, but in the second and third rounds, he started going for desperation takedowns, and while Anheliger defended successfully, he was also landing damage, which ultimately allowed the judges to score it in Anheliger's favor. I don't know if Grigoriou is good enough to actually be in the UFC, so it's kind of hard for me to be totally confident in him at minus 220. And yes, he has a clear striking advantage here over Kazama, but it would not surprise me at all if Kazama is able to wrap him up against the cage in some sort, jump on his back, just as Anheliger was close to doing as well in their fight, or even look to guard pull here and eventually find a reversal and get on top of Grigoriou. However, I think that we'll see that striking that we should have seen from Grigoriou last time around. I think we'll see him traverse the cage well here, utilize his speed advantage, utilize his striking advantage, really touch up Kazama, and eventually find that knockout. I must say, though, this is probably my least confident prediction on the entire card, and I would want none of that minus 220, especially if Kazama is successful in wrapping him up and getting his grappling going. But I'm going to go Grigoriou, and Grigoriou by knockout. Next up, flyweights going at it here. Very intriguing matchup in my opinion, as we have two BJJ black belts, the first of which, Nascimento, coming in at minus 205, looking to make his return after 20 months away from action, going up against Filho, who's coming in at plus 175. Now, I'll start off on the Nascimento side of things, who dropped his UFC debut to Tagir Ulanbekov. Close fight, or at least a much more competitive fight than people were expecting it to, but has managed to bounce back with two dominant victories. He had that victory over Jake Hadley in 2022, and then last time around, submitted Carlos Hernandez in January of 2023. Unfortunately, Nascimento has sat on the sidelines ever since and has been unable to compete and continue this run that he is on. This guy, like I said, is a BJJ black belt, leaves a lot to be desired in the striking realm, but when he can get a hold of his opponents, he's very difficult to deal with because of that jiu-jitsu, because of his scrambling ability and his ability to maintain position against a lot of opponents. I really think it's just his lack of striking that's going to keep him from getting into the top 10 of the division and ultimately keep him from achieving the goals that he has at this level. He's still only 32 years old, so he's pretty much in his prime, so I think we'll see the best version of him. But you do have to consider the ring rust that he has coming into this matchup after being out of the cage for as long as he has. On the flip side, for Filho, we're talking about a guy who I believe earned his UFC contract and has had 3 fights. He earned his UFC contract back at... I believe it was in 2022. Let me just quickly confirm that. I'm not sure why I think it's 2023. Yeah, it's 2022 and has had 3 UFC fights since the last time Nascimento has stepped in the cage. We saw him obviously earn that contract with a quick victory over Roy Echeverria. Then he had a somewhat back and forth fight against Mohamed Mokaev. He lost the first round, but showed great defense in terms of his grappling and trying to get out of these bad positions. Second round, 2 judges actually gave him that round on the scorecards. And then the third round, we saw him with that very close knee bar that most opponents probably would have tapped to. And we saw some clear damage on Mokaev after the fight had concluded. But Mokaev eventually reversed the position, got the back, and got the rear naked choke submission of his own. But since then, Filho has bounced back with a submission victory over Daniel Barres, and then a quick domination of O'Day Osborne. Filho has a very solid striking game where he throws a lot of power. He's very consistent with the leg kicks that he throws as well. And in the grappling realm, I think he is pretty damn good. He does a lot of the small things right. He makes sure his opponents don't get the hooks in. He digs his underhooks when he needs to. He doesn't give up bad positions for too long either. Another aspect of his defensive grappling that I love is when guys try to implement the body lock, the I don't know why the name is escaping me, but when they figure four the body from the back control, he does a great job in terms of going to the side to put pressure on the lock, and then he does a good job in terms of even applying pressure on the lock by pushing down on his opponent's foot, and that causes them to break the lock. And as soon as they break the lock, he does a great job in terms of exploding out of those positions and then either reversing or getting back to his feet so that he can get back to his striking. This guy is very good in my opinion. I don't think he's getting a lot of the respect that he deserves. You're talking about a guy that's trained out of Nova União for the majority of his career, come up with Jose Aldo when Aldo was near the top of his game back in, we're talking about 10 years ago, but still Filho was a youngster back then, only 21 at the time. Now he's 31, has a wealth of experience under him as well. And I think he's more than liable to pull off the upset here against Nascimento. Sure, Nascimento could have some grappling success here, but I think we'll see Filho utilize his defensive grappling well, keep Nascimento away from those positions. I think Filho will end up being the better scrambler as well in terms of getting out of bad positions and then getting back to the feet, where I think he'll have a solid striking advantage. And I think he has way more power than Nascimento has on the feet, so will be even more of a threat in the striking realm. So in a fight that I could see as being way more 50-50 than, almost 70% implied for Nascimento, I have to lean with Filho here. I think they're almost the same fighter, but I think that Filho is a far better striker than Nascimento is a better grappler than Filho, and that could end up being the difference maker in this matchup. So I'm going to go with the dog here. I'm going to go Filho. Ring rust, striking advantage, good enough scrambling, good enough BJJ. He should be able to stay out of too much danger here and eventually find the finish, or actually land more damage and win this fight on the scorecards. All right, next up, women's bantamweight matchup, as we have Yana Santos coming in at minus 135, taking on Chelsea Chandler, who comes in at plus 115. Now, starting off with the Yana Santos side, who's 0-3 over her last 3 fights, but she's 0-2 since returning from a hiatus where she ended up marrying former UFC fighter Thiago Santos, had a baby with him, and then came back into the fold, and the UFC was like, you know what? Here's Holly Holm. And she ends up going out there and getting grinded out over the course of 15 minutes. She follows that up with a loss to Carol Rosa last time, where she had some glimpses of success, but ultimately Rosa was the one landing better shots, had some good grappling success as well, and just Santos was unable to deal with the damage that was coming back and the optics of what Rosa was doing. Santos at her best is a fighter that utilizes the clinch very well. She's very powerful with her long, rangy frame that she has. She pushes her opponents up against cage, roughs them up there, utilizing some knees, some dirty boxing, good elbows as well. And if she's able to get fights to the ground, she can do some good work from that top position. In the striking realm, she's quite average. She does a good job in terms of moving her feet, utilizing straight punches down the pipe, using her kicks up the middle. But I think the best part about her game, at 34 years old, having 22 fights of experience, is the level of competition that she's been fighting. And that's going to be very important for her going up against somebody who's still quite green and raw in their MMA career. She's going up against Chelsea Chandler, who is now 2-1 in the UFC. And most recently coming off that victory over Josiane Nunes, which was her first attempt at fighting at bantamweight in the UFC, and she missed weight by a pound. Now, she fought at bantamweight earlier in her career, 5 years ago specifically, and has yet to make 136 pounds since then. So that's something to keep an eye on this weekend and see if she can actually make that weight. But it didn't seem to phase her last time around, even with her missing weight, by going out there and defeating Josiane Nunes the way that she did. She used her size and her strength to bully Nunes to the ground and have some good damage from that top position. She won those first 2 rounds. Third round did not look that good. Nunes was doing a great job in terms of walking her down and landing big power shots and taking advantage of the reckless and very raw striking style of Chelsea Chandler. Chandler does not look comfortable in the striking realm at all, and she is very open to being countered by her opponents, something that Santos could potentially take advantage of. I think this fight is going to be won and lost in the clinch, though, and I think that Santos will have an advantage there, and Chandler could have some success of her own, being a pretty physically strong woman herself, but I think the experience of Santos and the technical advantages of Santos will end up reigning supreme in the spot. I'm seeing some love come in on Chandler, which has pushed Santos down from minus 150 to about minus 135. I've even seen minus 125 floating around certain places, but I do think that Santos is the side in this matchup. In a fight that could end up going to a split decision, but I do think that Santos ends up landing the better damage, getting the better of most of these exchanges, and winning this fight on the scorecards. All right, next up, Danny Barlow coming into his second UFC fight at welterweight, coming in as a minus 325 favorite, going up against Nikolai Veretennikov, who comes in at plus 275. Now, Danny Barlow is one of the prospects that I think a lot of people need to keep an eye on. He's 8-0, a southpaw, left hand to God is his nickname because of the power that he possesses with that straight left down the pipe. This guy doesn't often set up his left hand very well, but he just continuously lands it because of the speed, footwork, and traps that he sets against his opponents. He comes from a bit of a wrestling background, but we don't often see him use it offensively, but more so defensively, so he can take advantage of his opponents in the striking round where that physical or those physical advantages that he has with the speed and the power comes into play. We saw it fully on display in his last fight against Josh Quinlan, who was looking to get the takedowns going but had no success and ultimately had to eat a platter of left punches down the pipe, which eventually caught up to him in that third round, and we saw Barlow get the finish there. Barlow is a very talented fighter with a ton of potential, and at 29 years old is on the brink of just really tapping into his potential, getting into his prime, and possibly even bursting himself into the rankings. He was scheduled to fight Earl Schmedich on this card. Medic pulls out with a rib injury, and in steps Nikolai Veretennikov, who was a Contender Series alum back in 2022, I believe it is, or 2021. And he ended up coming up short that night against Michael Morales, who's obviously killing it in the UFC as of right now. Since then, Veretennikov took a little bit of time off, went back to the regional scene, produced 3 straight finishes against mediocre talent on the regional scene, and ultimately gets signed to this short notice appearance so he can finally make it to the UFC. He's 34 years old, trains out of King's MMA, has a decent all-around game, has some good power in his punches, although I will say the last 2 knockout victories that he had, a little bit of an early stoppage, if I must say so. And I think I would plead for you guys to go back and watch those fights. He might have been able to finish those guys anyway had the referee not stopped it, but I still felt like it was a bit of an early stoppage in both those fights against Iniguez and Reese. But Veretennikov, he can be beaten. He is a guy that will get demoralized if things are really not going his way, just as we saw against Michael Morales. He might look to grapple here against Barlow, but I think Barlow will showcase even more of his takedown defense and his grappling defense, which is where people really start to realize that this kid is the real deal and he has the potential to get into that top 10 of the welterweight division. And then from there, I think we'll see Barlow showcase his speed advantage, his power advantage, and I think that will eventually lead him to knocking Veretennikov out within the first 2 rounds. All right, I believe this is the co-main event. With all the cancellations and stuff over the last couple of days, the card is still in flux in terms of where the placements of these fights are going to be, but I believe this is the one that they're going to end up going with as the co-main event between Damon Jackson coming in at plus 185, going up against Chepe Mariscal, who comes in at minus 220 in this featherweight matchup. Now we'll start off on the Damon Jackson side of things, who was able to grind out a decision victory over Anthony Hernandez last time around in a fight where he got hit a couple times, got hurt a couple times, but ultimately the judges favored the control that he was able to get and the damage that he was able to land in those spots as well. Damon Jackson is a guy that largely relies on finishing his opponents early, where opponents have been able to survive and then eventually start to take over in deep waters. So it was impressive to see him actually go to a decision here and actually end up getting his hand raised. He's very dangerous when he gets his jiu-jitsu going, as he's very active in terms of seeking submissions or trying to get to a position where he can posture up and land big damage of his own. He's 36 years old, so he's definitely getting up there in age, and that's something to keep an eye on, especially in these lower weight classes where when age starts to become a factor, guys start to slow down and then they're not able to deal with the physical advantages that the younger opponents normally have over them. But Damon Jackson is a all-action fighter, very entertaining, and even when he is slowing down, he does start to throw back with as much heat as he can to try to stay active enough, but he does end up getting a little bit more sloppy, and that's where opponents are able to take advantage of him, just as we saw with Dan Ige and Billy Quarantillo in his last 2 losses. But that win over Hernandez should give him some confidence. Now, his opponent, Chepe Mariscal, is now 3-0 since entering the UFC on short notice, showcasing that all the high-level experience that he gained on the regional scene is now coming to be very helpful in the UFC, as they're pretty much throwing, guys like Trevor Peek, Jack Jenkins, and Morgan Charrier his way, and he's having good success. Say what you want about the Charrier fight, close fight, but I believe they ended up scoring it for Mariscal in rounds 3 and round 1. Round 1 being very close. Could have gone either way. The Jack Jenkins fight, he wasn't doing too well in the first round, but really started to push the aggression in the second round, and that's where that injury ended up happening to Jack Jenkins, but it seemed like momentum was very much in Mariscal's favor, and then Mariscal showed the levels against Trevor Peek. Close fight where Peek landed some big shots of his own, but Mariscal was clearly the better technical fighter that night. Mariscal, very good wrestler, very good scrambler, has a very good cardio game as well, so he's able to put pressure on his opponents and start to run away in deep waters, and his striking game is coming together very well. And an issue that I've had with him in the past is his durability. It seems like that's kind of a thing of the past, and if he continues to showcase an iron chin as he has over his last couple of fights, he's going to be a very tough fighter to deal with. I don't know if he's going to be a guy that cracks the top 10 of the featherweight division, but he's going to be one of those Dan Ige-esque fighters where he keeps the guys from getting into title contention, or at least even getting into the top 10. He's very good, very talented, and just an absolute dog. And I think that's why he's such a minus 220 favorite here against Damon Jackson. Originally, I thought that the line's a little bit too wide, but I think it's kind of correct where it is. Jackson will have success early here, but given the scrambling ability and just constant work rate of Mariscal, I think we're going to see Jackson really start to slow down and later on in this matchup, and that could potentially open up finishing opportunities for Mariscal, especially in the third round. I wouldn't even be surprised if he finishes him in that third round. My official prediction is going to be him by Mariscal by decision. As long as he doesn't get finished early here, Jackson is very live to get a finish early, but if he's not, rounds 2 and 3 should go Mariscal's way, whether it's a round 3 finish or Mariscal winning this fight on the scorecards. All right, that brings us to our main event. Like I said, we start the night with a rematch between Stephanie Luciano and Talita Alencar. We end the night with a rematch between Marcin Tybura, who comes in at plus 125, going up against Sergey Spivac, who comes in at minus 145. Now, the first time that these guys fought, I believe in February of 2020, Tybura was a minus 125, minus 135 favorite, and now he finds himself as the underdog in the spot. Tybura pretty much wiped the mat with Spivac that night. Spivac was still very young in the cage, in his MMA career. He was also 20 pounds less than he currently is right now, and we saw Tybura put the full MMA game on him, eventually grinding him out with grappling and eventually winning that fight on the scorecards. Since that fight, I believe... Tybura, starting with that fight, Tybura is 8-2 over his last 10 fights. His only 2 losses have come to current interim champion Tom Aspinall and current top heavyweight Alexander Volkov. He is a guy that will always stay near that top 5 to 7 in the heavyweight division. He is 38 years old right now, so maybe his time is slowly coming to a close. But he's showing in recent performances against guys like Blagoy Ivanov, Alexander Romanov, and Tai Tuivasa that he is still capable of high-level performances. But just his all-around MMA game, solid striker, good grappling. I believe he's a BJJ brown belt. Great cardio for a heavyweight as well, so he can go 15 or 25 if he needs to. And just great fight IQ and experience as of late. Really turned the table from when he started his career with the promotion. I believe he was at a 500 rate. He was very up and down to start his UFC career, but since then has really started to skyrocket and get to this point where he's main event in Apex cards every now and then. His opponent, Sergey Spivac, like I said, lost that fight to Spivac. Since that matchup, he is now 6-2 with his last 2 losses coming against Cyril Gane, where he got finished back in September last year, and then against Tom Aspinall, a fight in which he took on short notice and got finished pretty quickly. Again, tough names to overcome, especially with Spivac still trying to find his way in the MMA game. We know what Spivac is good at. When he gets his game going, he gets opponents to the ground, grinds them out from that top position, finds finishes, finds TKO opportunities, but he's very good from that top position. His wrestling is improving, his overall game is improving, but it hasn't improved enough to go out there and beat a guy like Marcin Tybura. I believe Tybura is still the better fighter of both these guys. Spivac has 8 more fights of experience since her last fight. He's added on an extra 20 pounds. Also, Tybura being 38, Spivac has the youth advantage. But I still feel that Tybura is more than capable of having solid all-around performances, and we've seen it as of late. I think the only advantage Spivac really has here is the age. But Tybura hasn't really shown anything that makes me believe he's really going to start slowing down in this at this stage of his career. Until we see a legitimate decline in his career, I still think he's the better overall fighter in this spot. Better striker, can compete in the wrestling, in my opinion. Maybe the better pure BJJ specialist, probably the better cardio. So it's kind of surprising to see him as a plus 125 dog in the spot, which is why I have to take a shot on him. Again, experience, striking advantage, everything I just laid out. I just think he is the better fighter in this spot. Spivac could, prove me wrong, and he could end up being the better wrestler at this stage of their career and end up grinding out Tybura over, at least 3 out of 5 rounds. But I think Tybura is going to be the one that just ends up landing more damage, creating better scrambles, taking advantage of the striking that he has here as well. So I'm going to go Tybura by decision. The over 2.5, I think, or over 3.5 is roughly around even money. That wouldn't be a bad spot to take advantage of, considering that both these guys really like to wear on their opponents, and considering how they both fight, this will likely go to the scorecards as well. So I'm going to go Tybura by decision, and as an underdog, not a bad spot either. There you guys go. Breakdowns on all 10 fights for this UFC Vegas 95 card. I'll be away for the weekend, but I should be able to drop the Contender Series breakdowns for you guys on Sunday, latest Monday. Week 1 starts next week. And then I'll also have breakdowns for UFC 305 starting this week on the Patreon page. So if you want early access to those UFC 305 breakdowns, check out the MMALOTN Patreon page. I'll probably start posting them within the next day or two. And then, as usual, the full card breakdown will come out on Monday for the next big pay-per-view. All right. Appreciate the love. Appreciate all the love. Appreciate all the support. I'll see you guys tomorrow for the top 3 lock of the night candidates. See you guys then. Peace.
Last thing.